A very good evening and welcome to Q&A. I'm Hamish McDonald, here to answer your questions tonight. The Executive Director of the Ethics Centre, Simon Longstaff. Liberal MP Tim Wilson, who has just returned from the streets of Hong Kong. Journalist and researcher at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, Vicky. The Financial Review's National Affairs columnist, Jennifer Hewett. And Labor's spokesman on cyber security, Tim Watts. Please put your hands together and welcome our panel. Q&A is live tonight in Eastern Australia on ABC TV, iView and News Radio. And our first question this evening is a video from a young woman that I met recently covering the protests in Hong Kong. Her name is Sally Ho.
So we've seen a sharp deterioration of freedoms in Hong Kong, especially since the emergency ordinance was evoked to pass a mask ban. This sets the tone for a slippery slope for more erosion of freedoms. Despite this, we've seen the NBA retract previous comments to appease the Chinese market. We've seen Trump pledge to keep quiet on the Hong Kong issue in a phone call, and the Australian Labor Party supporting stronger defence ties with China. I guess my question to the panel is Australia willing to stand up for the rights and freedoms of Hong Kongers and risk angering China?
Well, Tim Watts, the question for you, is Labor willing to stand up for those things?
Well, Hamish, it's pretty clear that we're in a new phase of our relationship with China at the moment. A lot of the assumptions that we had about the ways that we could engage with China from the early 90s through the 2000s, they're showing not to hold anymore. And in this new environment, this new sort of more assertive, authoritarian China really demands more of all Australians, not just political leaders, business leaders, cultural leaders. It demands a greater understanding, greater dexterity in the way that we approach things. But really what it requires is us to see China for what it actually is. And that's a country with a different political system to ours, different values to ours. We really need to keep that in the forefront of our mind in this engagement so that we don't lose ourselves when we engage with China with things that we do have shared interests on.
But how do you justify to a young person in this region who sees your party saying that Australia should have closer military ties with China?
Well, what we've said is that where there are areas of shared interests, like international peacekeeping missions to uphold a rules-based order, sure, Australia should work closely with China on that. But in areas where we don't share the same objectives, we don't share the same values, we need to set up clear boundaries, clear guiding lines so that we don't compromise ourselves in that engagement.
Tim Wilson, you've obviously made your position on this clear. Do you think, though, Australia more broadly is willing to muscle up to China?
Well, I think we have to stand up very clearly for our values and what we believe in as a country when we're engaging with any nation, doesn't matter which one it is. Yes, I've made my view obviously extremely clear, and for a number of reasons. Firstly, because, and people forget this, in the last term of Parliament, there was a proposal for Australia to ratify our own extradition treaty with China. A number of backbenchers, including myself, Andrew Hastie, James Patterson, John O'Dunningham, amongst others, stood up and opposed that, and ultimately it never made it to the Parliament. And that was one of the core original motivators of these protests. Also, obviously, because I'm a Liberal Democrat and I believe in the values that underpin a cause for liberal democracy around the world. But the other reason is also to make sure there's proper scrutiny and accountability with China. They know the world is watching, and how they behave and respond in Hong Kong is critical, and that we all play a role in that. And that's why I've been very happy to see the Foreign Minister in particular being very strong in her language around China and saying that we don't believe in the crackdown on people in Hong Kong. They have a right to protest, and that's obviously very consistent with things that I believe are too.
But it's a bigger question, though, about whether Australia is willing to stand up to China on all manner of things. Well, you can see the influence that it has already in Australia.
Well, that's true, and I know in the program before tonight there was a lot of discussion around university campuses, and the Education Minister has actually put a very clear focus on making sure that we're not seeing education unduly influenced by foreign influence. We've had our own government and the Minister for Home Affairs focusing on unpicking foreign influence in terms of our political system, and obviously that's still got some to come out, and we need to keep doing it. And it's not going to be a singular approach. It's going to be making sure that we confront these challenges at every point to stand up for our national interests, to be proud of our values, what we stand for as a country, but of course working with other countries as part of a community of nations in the region.
We have an additional question from Hong Kong, which I suppose adds to that. It's from the former chair of the Hong Kong Democracy Party, Emily Lau.
Does the panel think that the Australian business people and the politicians are maybe too eager to make money, to get into the China market, and so are willing to turn a blind eye to human rights violations in China and elsewhere?
Vicky Xu, is that the case? Is China too hungry? Is Australia too hungry for China's money to really take a strong position?
I think partly, yes. You know, China is a large market with 1.4 billion people. So, of course, it's a very attractive market. But at the same time, I do think we have a bit of blind optimism about the Chinese market. The government and also business people, when they're going into China, they're not understanding the risks and the consequences that could happen in China. You know, now we're waking up because we see NBA, we see even the gamer world is realizing that, wait a second, Tencent owns 10% of the company. And, you know, when one gamer says something about Hong Kong, he gets banned, his prize money gets taken away. We're just waking up. But this has been happening for decades, you know, just last year, sometimes not, you know, businesses get punished not just for saying the wrong thing. Just last year, because China and Australia, the relationship wasn't great, China closed up a port, you know, to stop Australian products from coming in. Regular businesses not saying anything become collateral damage. So while we know that China means great opportunity for business, we also should know, and government should make this common knowledge and common sense, that China also means great consequences.
Jennifer Hewett, do you agree with that analysis that Australia displays blind optimism when it comes to China?
Well, I think there's a reason for the blind optimism, a very kind of strong economic reason. You know, Australia has, the Australian economy has been very dependent on the Chinese economy for a long time now, particularly after the global financial crisis. And since then, our commodities have been you know, able to be exported, and the Chinese market was obviously very attractive. I think the challenges now about dealing with China under Xi Jinping are becoming more apparent to everyone. At the same time, I think it's also very clear that Australia can't afford to just, you know, try and cut itself off from China, and it does have to behave mostly in a respectful manner, even when it disagrees with what China is doing.
Have we been too focused on perhaps China's military rise and not focused enough on the other ways in which China uses its power?
I think that is right. I think we obviously, you know, there's things like the militarisation of the South China Sea and are very, you know, clear examples of that. I think what has been less obvious, for example, has been until recently the impact of Chinese influence in other ways. For example, in the universities, what's happening there, that has been very easy and again very attractive for universities to ignore because, of course, they've wanted the money coming in. So all of those harder choices now are becoming much more obvious, I think, in part because China is no longer being, you know, fairly, you know, hiding its light behind a bushel and is being quite assertive in how it sees the world, which is often extremely different to how Australians see the world, except, of course, we have 1.2 million Chinese in Australia, and many of those, I mean, it's an evolving situation. I think we're still struggling as a country, as a cultural and political leadership and business leaders trying to figure out how to get the best out of our relationship with China without compromising ourselves. There is no easy answer to that.
Simon Longstaff, money, principles, which wins?
Well, we've heard about two things so far, fear and greed. Neither is a particularly good basis on which to engage in a complicated relationship such as arises here. I think what we need to try and do firstly is become much more clear for ourselves about what we stand for and back that. And then I think... Is
that a problem that we...
Yeah, I think it is. I think that I think we are quite uncertain here. I think our own ethical infrastructure is either damaged or broken in many ways. So we've got some work here. But Jennifer put a finger on, I think, a very important point. It's not just that you are firm in your own convictions. You then need to think how to engage also on as constructive a basis as you can to bring about some kind of meeting in mind and change. And the first thing I think is to try and better understand China itself. It's deeply concerned to avoid a perpetual history, really, where the centre is constantly weakened by rising provinces. You go right back into the ancient history of China, and I think Vicky would acknowledge too that in China there's a deep commitment to harmony and order as a prior concern over some of the issues of liberty. Now, I'm not saying that that's right, but we should at least understand it as a basis for how we engage.
How I see it is in China, it's entrenched in our education and in the media that we have a history of, of 100 years of humiliation. But we also have to understand that is partly true, but also partly weaponized to entrench this idea that we Chinese and the West, we're on different sides. China's rise has to be at the expense of the West's collapse. And if we want to become strong again, we want to rise to superpower status again, it means we have to beat down the West.
But does it have to be like that, from your point of view?
It doesn't have to be like that, but we said we want to understand China better. That is the psyche of a lot of Chinese
sometimes
officials.
we shouldn't be hypocritical about this. Sometimes we do exactly the same thing. You'll see in countries like Australia and the US, when under threat, we will suppress liberties in the name of security and order. We do it all the time. And a few people speak out against it, but otherwise we say, oh, it's just normally what we do to make ourselves safe.
Is that what the government that Tim Wilson's a member of is doing?
It has certainly done that. And there have been governments of all hues that have played that particular card when curbing what liberties we would otherwise claim to enjoy. But I don't make that to say that we should therefore excuse the Chinese government or say that we are always going to be like them. I think there are more nuanced positions we can take to understand this and navigate those very difficult waters.
All right. Our next question tonight comes from Jenny Lee.
The Hong Kong problem eventually is an economic problem, which really has less to do with freedom and democracy. Democracy is a weapon. If used by selfish and uneducated people, it could only harm themselves. I'm surprised that Liberal MP Tim Wilson could not see that. Could the Liberal Party focus more on our own economy rather than other people's affairs? I guess that was why we voted for you guys. We want you guys to improve Australia's economy so we can live comfortably. We don't have to go to the street and protest against our own government.
Tim Wilson, Jenny's asking why you're there, worrying about the situation in Hong Kong, rather than doing what she voted for your party to do, which is fix the economic problems here.
Well, the Liberal Party has many purposes. In fact, you go to one of the core statements of liberalism and the Liberal Party itself, it talks about how free people must be triumphant everywhere in the world, and it is core to who we are, and that's the basis in which I sought election. There are, on economic freedom, on social freedom, on political freedom, it's critical to who we are as a country. I was actually in Hong Kong talking at a conference for The Economist on democracy actually in Australia as part of Southeast Asia. And I think if we want to engage with respect and we want to engage with the region in a constructive way, we need to have these conversations and be part of advancing Australia's interest with the community of nations and having that respectful understanding of many countries. But
is it a constructive way, though, for you to go and participate in a protest, some elements of which were violent?
Well, I think every good cause will always attract bad people. That's the reality. And so
but you're talking as a politician about doing something constructive in that broader conversation.
Yes.
I'm asking if that was the appropriate forum for you to do it.
And I believe it was, because if you actually go back to what I said right at the start, one of the reasons why there has been an allowance for people to continue to protest in an authoritarian regime, it's because people know the world is watching. And one of the key points that I was trying to make was that people in Australia, and you can see it in the panel tonight, and the questions tonight, is that people are paying attention and people want to see and have a fondness for Hong Kong and for people's right to live their lives.
How do you think Australia would react if a Chinese politician came here and started protesting, joining perhaps a climate strike?
Oh, well, they'd be welcome to do so because we respect people's rights and freedoms. That's the nature of our country. And that's what it means to actually live out the values of a country. And that is the principal basis in which we have the organisation of our polity.
Tim, what's your view of politicians from Australia going to other countries, participating in protests. Is that the right way to have a constructive conversation?
Look, Hamish, the way I look at this is that I think we are back now in a world of competing systems. You know, like probably my father's generation, they grew up in that competing systems between the sort of communist world and the free world. We're back now in a world of systems competition between, you know, the liberal democratic order, open economies, and this new model of technology-enabled autocracy or techno-authoritarianism. Now, I don't think that's a battle that's going to be won by who's able to give the best lecture to another country, or it's going to be won overseas.
What's techno-authoritarianism?
Well, I mean, the way I view techno-authoritarianism, it's the use of technology to control populations, to perpetuate the power of a ruling body in a country. And it's certainly something we're seeing in a range of countries around the world.
So these are all the cameras on the streets of Hong Kong, capturing all the images, feeding it back possibly to
Well,
Beijing.
it's data collection in a range of countries and the use of that data in a way to control society, to control people within a country. But the way that we'll win that competition of systems, and there are people that want to bring that system into the West, into countries like Australia, through populist campaigns, but the way that we will win that competition isn't overseas, it's in this country. It will win it by its living up to our democratic values, by championing our democratic institutions, by saying that it's wrong for the Australian Federal Police to raid journalists, by properly funding the ABC, by really making these investments in the things that protect and preserve our democracy. So I suppose what I'd say to Tim is the next time I want to see Tim fighting for those values in our country, as an example for the rest of the world.
I wonder whether you agree with what Simon Longstaff was talking about, which is that Australia's problem in responding to China is grounded in the fact that we're not quite sure who we are. That's something you've been writing about, our own sort of search for our contemporary identity.
Absolutely. I think we don't spend enough time talking about what it is to be Australian. I mean, I've got a new book out at the moment. My publisher would kill me if I didn't say it.
This is not for you to publicise it.
The Golden Country, available in all good bookstores. But, I mean, the point is that we don't do enough talking about what it means to be Australian today, and that inherent to those values isn't just mateship, egalitarianism, the fair go, those things that we do treasure, but it's also a respect for democratic institutions and a model of society.
Your wife, I think, was born in Hong Kong. You've got 2 kids. What do you talk to them about in terms of what it is to be Australian today, if we're confused about it?
Well, it's an optimistic story. I think the genius of Australia is that our political system enables us to change. My great-great-great-great-grandfather was a member of the anti-Chinese leagues in Geelong. He was part of a group that sent a petition to the Victorian Parliament imposing the poll tax on Chinese arrivals to Australia. He didn't want members of my current family in Australia today to be part of the nation that he was building. They were wrong. Those were the values that Australia was founded on at the time of Federation. It's no coincidence that the first really substantive piece of high policy, as Edmund Barton called it, passed by the Federation Parliament was the Immigration Restriction Act, the White Australia policy. That wasn't a coincidence because that was really intrinsic to the kind of nation we were building at that time. But we've transcended that. We've outgrown it. Our democratic system has enabled us to recognise the mistakes that were made and to build a far greater nation today, one of the most successful multicultural nations in the world.
Jennifer, do you think we're lost as a nation?
No, I absolutely do not think we're lost. And I'm happy to read your book, Tim. But actually, I think Australia is actually one of the most successful countries in terms of multiculturalism, in terms of being a very high immigrant society, far higher proportion of people born in Australia, born overseas in Australia than I think any other country in the world. And similarly with second generation. And we've done that remarkably well. I think we spend an inordinate amount of time speaking about ourselves and trying to understand ourselves and how the country has changed. And in general, I think it's been very, very successful.
Yeah, there's a but, though. And the but is for a successful multicultural society with monocultural institutions. So we've got at the moment around 14% of the Australian population of Asian heritage. Now, across our politics, our business, our universities, our public service, leadership positions, Asian Australian representation is at like a maximum of about 3%. And to put that in terms that are sort of understandable, that means in the federal parliament, we ought to have over 30 Asian Australians.
Well,
just imagine how different this conversation would be if we had representation
well,
like that in those perspectives.
I do think that's right. I mean, and I think this is an issue. For example, you could have the same attitude about women in leadership positions. There's lots of reasons for that, and one of the reasons has been kind of different kind of cultural backgrounds for a lot of people from an Asian background who are not so keen to take leadership positions in the same way or to behave in the same way that people who've grown up in a different culture do. So I think those are the types of reasons that we don't see the numbers changing. But I do think you see them in a community level, and that is eventually and will change and is changing over time.
So I could believe that, except for the fact that peer countries like Canada, the UK, the United States, they do far better at this representational issue than we do in Australia. So there is something intrinsic in Australia. There's something about that representational level where Australian multiculturalism works really well at the community level and then breaks down when we get to the doors of power in our society, in our institutions.
Can I just bring in Vicky here? You've come to Australia in recent years. How do you observe this conversation? Do you think Australia has a clear identity, that we know who we are and what we stand for?
I'm absolutely with Tim on this one, and I've been working in journalism for a number of years. I've had one editor who's not a white male. And I don't think that as minorities we're not keen to take leadership positions, and not as far as anyone that I know. I think we're all super keen to lead.
Well, you are anyway.
I am anyway. And I do think there's a lot to improve on. I do think representation is a problem in politics and the media. It is improving by sitting here. I think I'm grateful to have this opportunity to be on this platform. It also means that we are being given a voice, some of us at least, but I don't think it's enough, and I think we have a long way to go.
But is diversity in the media and in politics the same thing as a nation having a clear sense of itself?
Australia is definitely still searching, but I think Australia definitely understands that it's a democracy. Like, that's something that we can all agree on. And I wanted to circle back to the thing about being respectful to authoritarian countries. Being respectful to the Asian community or the Chinese community here is not the same thing as subscribing to those rhetorics such as China has been humiliated, therefore we cannot criticize Chinese government policies. I think there is this effort from the Chinese state to gaslight us by saying if you ever criticize Chinese policies, you are being racist, you are being unfair to the millions of tourists, students, and Chinese Australians. And that's completely false. And I think in building a national identity of Australia, we also need to be clear-headed. We also need to stand really on democratic values and not cave in.
This evening's conversation, though, started with a question to the Labor Party, to Tim Watts, about it wanting closer military ties with Beijing. I mean, Xi Jinping in the last 24 hours has talked about crushing bodies and shattering bones. Is there any grey zone on this matter? I mean, is China a country that we should be moving closer towards in terms of military relations?
As Tim pointed out, there are peacekeeping missions that we can cooperate on.
And you think that's all right?
Yeah, but in terms of, for example, South China Sea, in terms of the Pacific, I do think, I don't think, unfortunately, there isn't much of a grey zone there.
All right. Well, our next question tonight comes from Sarah Myatt.
While a handful of our politicians have come out in support of the protests in Hong Kong, many have been quick to condemn climate change protesters in Australia. What can young people in Australia rightfully do to make their fears and concerns heard?
Simon Longstaff.
Well, I think that we should admire any person who is willing to take action in defence of their beliefs. I'm immensely proud of the fact that particularly young people have seen fit to do that. I think we also have to have some point of discrimination between the kind of protest activity which gives rise to inconvenience for other people, as opposed to the protest activity which is intended to inconvenience people. If you get a couple of 100,000 people in a street or a larger number, whether it's here or abroad, it is bound to cause inconvenience for those who come into contact with them. As I think Tim was suggesting, there are some people who attach themselves to these causes who just want to cause mayhem and havoc, and we should be deeply disturbed by those people who bring violence to those protests, who seek to subvert their good intentions. So I was pretty appalled when I've heard people in Australia criticising those who have got a strong, committed belief in the justification of their cause, and young, old and all sorts of people going out to find them criticised. And I mentioned in passing to Tim when he was talking about the right to protest, said except if you're on welfare, where it seems to have been suggested that you lose those rights in certain circumstances. So I'd say to young people, don't lose heart that your voice matters. Be prepared to act in defence of your beliefs. That's part of what it means to be growing into the full citizenship that you ought to enjoy.
Tim Wilson, how would you respond?
Well, about 90% of what Simon just said I completely agree with. I think some people have misinterpreted some comments that were made by others where they're saying under a system of mutual obligation around welfare that you can't use protesting as an excuse not to meet your obligations, like going and seeking out employment as well. But I mean, I think we all want to operate in a country where people have a right to be able to protest so long as they sort of stick within the law. They don't. Then there's an issue around. There is an issue around proportionality. If people are deliberately...
So can I just pull you up on that, though, because the question to Peter Dutton was whether protesters who received government benefits should have their welfare payments removed. And he said, well, I agree. Well, what was the nuance that people missed in that?
Well, but I think the point is under a system of mutual obligation, the objective is that people have an expectation that if they receive welfare benefits and they're seeking work, they should be able to do so. I don't think things are blanket. Now, if you want more detail on the nuance of his question, you have to ask that, but that's the spirit of...
But I think he should have been far more careful in response to that, because it seemed like, and it was certainly interpreted by people, I think of goodwill, that he was suggesting that because you're in a condition where you're on welfare, that somehow or other you've lost your right.
And the reality is that is not the case in this country, and I believe that will be the case in this country. But if people willingly go about trying to obstruct other people and have no respect for their rights and freedoms at the same time as they're seeking to protest, then it raises issues around the contest of rights. And so we need to be able to respect them. But if people have concerns about climate change or any other issue, and the broad principle that Simon started with is that people should be able to stand up and speak out and have their voice. And that's the nature and the origins, or the anchoring principles of a liberal democracy.
So I suppose that what you would have observed in Hong Kong, though, is that it's a very small coterie of people that are actually causing the violence, doing the willful destruction, and yet the authorities, the people with power, use that small group against the entire lot.
Yes.
Can you see parallels between those reactions there and what's happening here in Australia?
No, well, you take the most recent Extinction Rebellion people at the moment. Nobody's saying that they reflect all of the concerns of everybody who's protesting on climate change.
There are very specific... them all right? Are you OK with some of the people in the Extinction Rebellion group?
From what I have seen of their behaviour, they deliberately go about to their own detriment, their own cause, frustrating people being able to live their life. And a gentleman who's emailed a few of us on the panel tonight talked about how with a disability he has been deliberately obstructed and put at extreme hardship as a consequence of their behaviour, and they've completely disregarded it. So they have a right to have their voice heard and express their opinion. They have a right to associate and to come together and protest that. But they have a right to just shut down everybody else's life in the process. No, that's going too far.
I have a feeling the person that's emailed some of you has also emailed us. The next question is a video from Matthew Zammit in Thornbury in Victoria.
My name is Matthew, and I've been heavily disrupted by the protests last week. Many people have, but as somebody with a few disabilities, it hits people like me harder. I tried to raise these concerns with protesters when they blocked my bus by chaining themselves on tram tracks. I was already in a lot of pain and already had to walk with my crutch much more than usual that morning. When I attempted to speak with people on one side of the street, I was jeered at and called offensive names. I struggled over to the other side of the street and had fruitless arguments with protesters there. I agree climate change is a very serious issue, but what balance do you think should be struck between the rights of people with disabilities and the right to protest?
Tim Watts, how do you do that?
Look, Hamish, I think it's a bit of a theme of mine. I think we just need to spend a little bit more time listening to each other in society. And there's a lot of talking past each other, a lot of shouting at each other in the current media and political environment.
With the Extinction Rebellion.
Yeah, sure. Like, I think genuinely, I think Extinction Rebellion protesters should listen to what Matthew just said there. take that into account. I mean, I've seen those protests make room for ambulances to get through, things of that nature. It seems pretty reasonable to say that they ought to be accommodating people with disability. That can't be the purpose of their protests. I'm sure they're not trying to inconvenience, cause physical pain to people, so they ought to really listen to that.
Jennifer Hewett, it's not just Extinction Rebellion, though, that some of our leaders have had a problem with. They've also had a problem with teenagers leaving school for the day to go out and protest. Where do we draw the line?
Well, it's always a question of balance and judgment, isn't it? I mean, I
seem
think
to struggle with that.
We do. I think we always have it, but now it's kind of more in the open, and everybody can have an opinion, so everybody can shout at one another and be heard via social media. It must be exhausting
being a columnist.
Well, I don't shout, of course. But I do think, for example, Extinction Rebellion protesters, obviously you could sympathise with some of their aims, but I mean, an awful lot of their aims just seem to be a kind of nihilistic kind of doomsday cult where, we're all ruined and we all should just kind of give up any fossil fuels tomorrow, as if there will not be any kind of massive economic impact and shocking, results for millions and millions of people. So I think that type of balance and that lack of balance is a problem. Of course, we should be able to talk to one another more easily than we do, and I think that's kind of, again, what we're struggling to learn to do in this world where shouting has just become the kind of the de facto reality for everybody. And somebody, in fact, Kath Tanner from Energy Australia was talking about the energy debate at Financial Review Summit the other day, and she said it was like being in at the bar at closing time. Everybody just wanted to yell at one another, and they're all convinced they're right. And I do think that's a big issue in society today.
You should try going on Twitter.
I tend to avoid it if I can.
Vicky, do you see the parallels, though, between the reaction here to some protesters and the reaction to protesters in Hong Kong who clearly want to disrupt?
I do a lot. I think, the protests in Hong Kong, they started out as just 2 million people walking on the streets peacefully. It's a bit like the climate strike from school kids, and they didn't cause any trouble. They were largely peaceful, but when the government doesn't respond, they grew desperate, and then they start, a small group of them started disrupting, and it's just the same here. The climate, the people who are pro-climate action, they started to disrupt. This is a show of desperation. These people are taking these measures knowing the price they have to pay. So it's more a reason that we should listen to them. But at the same time, I think what it takes, I agree with Tim again, it takes a bit of empathy from all sides. In Hong Kong, still now, but more earlier days, in last month and the month before, the protesters, they actively try to help people who, they've caused trouble too. They try to apologize, they try to persuade people, we're doing this for democracy, we're doing this for our cause, please forgive us. So I think this is something that maybe Extinction Rebellion could learn from, try to empathize a bit more and try not to inconvenience other people too much while getting your message out there.
Now remember, if you hear any doubtful claims on Q&A tonight, let us know on Twitter, and keep an eye on the RMIT ABC Fact Check and the Conversation website. Our next question this evening comes from Tyler Gashesky.
Thank you, Hamish. As an American citizen, I see so many countries around the world starting to lose faith in the once nation that I loved. Australia has always had a strong relationship with the US, but where and when does the country draw a line and stand up to the US on issues such as Syria?
Tim Wilson. Is it time to stand up to the United States?
Well, we always work with countries and make pretty clear, assertive statements, both publicly and privately, as we have been with China, and the Prime Minister's actually been quite clear that he's quite concerned about the developments that are occurring in Syria. I am too, just for absolute clarity. But it's not just about the United States. There's a number of parties that are actually involved in what's going on here. At the moment, we're concerned about the withdrawal of the United States. We're concerned about the inaction of Europe over a long period of time. But frankly, the thing I'm most concerned about is the involvement of Turkey and their behaviour in crossing over the border.
They were given a pretty big public green light.
I don't quite agree with that phrasing, but I do think it's.
How would you describe the US decision?
Well, the US
what signal that sent to Turkey?
The US had made a decision some time ago and had announced that they were seeking to withdraw. Now, whether or not I'm agreeing with that decision. There's a time frame to that, and other countries had a responsibility to step up as well. I don't think that's, oh, by the way, a green light, you can just go in and basically
But there was a Trump
create a
tweet
military conflict
that said that Turkey's about to do this and the United States is leaving.
No, and what he's also said is he believes there should be sanctions and everything else. I'm not trying to defend
He said that afterwards, once there was a bit of...
I think, as I said, I have very deep concerns around the position of the United States and what they've done, but I don't think we should also be turning a blind eye to the decisions of Turkey and also of the European Union, which are extremely serious.
was a question about our alliance with the United States.
That's right. And as I said, we've made it quite clear that we have deep concerns about the decisions being made.
Have you articulated your position on the US decision here? What is it?
Sorry, to
the US decision to... No, publicly. Have you said what you think about the United... So do you think it was the wrong thing for the United States?
I have deep concerns about it, and I want those communicated.
And why are you expressing deep concerns?
Why? Because there's obviously consequences to the decisions that are being made, but there are also consequences to the decisions that are being made by Turkey and the inaction of the European Union as well. So I have concerns on a number of fronts across a number of countries.
Tim Watts, do you think Australia is being forthright enough in expressing those sorts of concerns?
I think the government could have been more direct in this particuar instance. And
what should they have said?
Well, saying that announcing the withdrawal and the way that the announcement was made on Twitter, I might add, wasn't helpful and has really triggered a very a catastrophic situation in that area. I just want to sort of address the nub of Tyler's question, though, and say that, like, we get it in Australia, you know, like, to paraphrase one of the great poets of the United States, like, America contains multitudes, you know, it contains the best of the world and some pretty horrible things as well. And the Australia-US alliance, it transcends any individual president to Prime Minister relationship. It's bigger than any individual president. Australia and the US, we do share similar values around the world, and Australians work with US diplomats, with US aid workers, with US military forces and intelligence officers to try and build that rules-based international order that is really essential to a middle power, a country like Australia's economic prosperity and our security interests. So we would miss the Americans if they're gone. They are flawed, I understand that, and we ought to express it to them when they make mistakes, privately in smaller instances, and publicly, like, for example, with the decision to go to war in Iraq in 2003, when the Australian Labor Party publicly said to the Americans, you're making a mistake here. But again, we would miss the Americans if they're gone. The net contribution they make to the world is far more on the positive side of the ledger.
We've got a number of Kurdish people in the audience tonight, including Gellibrand. Do you think what you're hearing shows that Australia is willing to muscle up to the United States and say if it thinks the US has done the wrong thing? Do you think the United States has done the wrong thing on leaving northern Syria?
Well, I don't think that the United States has done the wrong thing. I think Trump has done the wrong thing. I should say we thank the United States for the help that they provide us during this war. But what Mr. Trump has done is absolutely, I don't see any justification in there. Because today I was just listening to one of his speeches that he was saying that we can't even protect our southern border. How can we protect you guys over there? Well, if this is the case, how come you call yourself the leader of this world? How come you sent 3,500 soldiers to Saudi Arabia just a couple of days ago?
So the United States relied on the Kurds in northern Syria to fight against ISIS. They were an important ally. How do the Kurds now view President Trump as an ally?
Well, we feel betrayed. You know, that is the word that we use. I don't think that the decision that he's made is in the interest of anyone, including the United States. He could have kept 50 soldiers there. That would have been enough to prevent Turkey and their sort of jihadist people to advance to the Kurdish area.
Do you think, Tim Wilson, that President Trump has betrayed the Kurds?
I think he's left him in an incredibly difficult position. Now, I don't think I can actually say whether that's how he feels, obviously, and I can understand. I don't actually think it's not being part of that community that I can project that, but I do think he's left him in an incredibly difficult situation. That's why I'm extremely concerned. But as I keep coming back, there's obviously the decision of Turkey, which is very disturbing. There's obviously the role and the influence that the European Union could be playing in this theatre, and there's also the role of the United States, and as you say, your criticisms toward President Trump. and I'm concerned about all three parties.
Simon Longstaff?
President Trump has betrayed the Kurds. He's been having conversations with Erdogan for months now about Turkey's desire to go into that area. They've been playing chicken with each other. It was President Trump's decision alone, and this is in relation to people who have sacrificed a huge amount as the shock troops to take on and defeat ISIS, albeit with Allied support, but they're the ones who are on the ground. And they had reasons to believe, they should have been able to believe that they could trust in some of their allies, particularly the most important of all, to stay true to the sacrifice that they'd made.
They were given some guarantees.
Yeah, whether the guarantees were written in blood or on ink, it doesn't matter. They were given it. That's a betrayal. And I fear that that part of the world... Now, what's the consequences? You've got people escaping from the camps, going back into ISIS strongholds. You've had the Kurdish community driven back into the arms of Assad and the Russians. I mean, how you can justify this on strategic grounds or any others baffles me. But the human cost for those communities of people who are now under threat is terrible. And I think betrayal is the only word that fairly describes it.
Well, yeah, I think it does describe it. It's not the first time, of course, that this has happened, and no one is going to say that dealing with Middle East politics is anything other than horrendous most of the time, with all sorts of grave human consequences and destruction much of the time. There was, of course, an issue with the US saying, look, we don't want to keep going on over here all the time, don't want to be here. But I think in this case it's very obvious, including from the incredible criticism of Trump's decision by many of his own party and many of his strong supporters, that this is in fact a grave strategic error, quite apart from the human catastrophe it involves. And that is, I think, one of the problems that you see with this president, that he has been willing to pull the rug out from allies so frequently, and certainly the Kurds are not alone in that.
Even though in that context to separate Trump from the United States, as has been done multiple times this evening? He's the leader of the United States.
Well, yes, of course he is, but I mean, you know, the US is made up of many people of different opinions, and you'd find no more fierce critics of him than other Americans, including, of course, the Democrats.
If the alliance is between peoples, I mean, that didn't stand for much for the Kurds, did it?
Well, no, but I mean, as Tim also said, I mean, these things do extend past presidents, but in this particular case, in terms of the relationship with a country like Australia, for example, but I think in this particular case, of course, the Kurds would feel betrayed, and I do think it's actually against US interests, which many of Trump's strongest supporters have made clear.
Our next question is a video from GISELLE Hall, an Australian filmmaker and former aid worker who's just crossed out of Syria into Iraqi Kurdistan.
Hi, my question is about the Australian women and children stranded in camps in northern Syria. Our government was warned again and again about the human rights and security risks of leaving people in these camps, and they failed to act. Now it seems like a worst-case scenario is unfolding, where adults who could have faced the justice system are escaping, and children who could have been safely brought home are in grave danger. Given these latest developments, how is the Australian government planning to fulfil its obligations to these Australian children who are in this situation through no fault of their own?
We will come to Tim Wilson in a moment, but Simon Longstaff, this is an incredibly difficult moral question for Australia, isn't it?
In some ways it's a very easy question, I think. You've got Australian citizens, I'm thinking here particularly of the children that Giselle's just spoken of, who through no fault of themselves find themselves exposed before this event, and particularly now after the event, to what I think would for most of us be unimaginable danger. And I understand why the government was trying to be cautious in its treatment of these people, but there was always a reasonable prospect of harm befalling these people. And I think, on balance, most Australians would say the adults should be held to account for the decisions that they've made. We should take responsibility for them, our fellow citizens, and hold them for account here within our justice system. It's been set up to do that, and particularly do that so that those children are not exposed to danger. That's why I think it's a fairly straight answer to such a question, that's what we ought to have done. And people might say, oh, well, it's hard to tell, and, you know, it's all very well now me saying this with the benefit of hindsight, but I think those principles could have been applied prospectively.
Tim Wilson, is it that simple?
Well, it's never that simple, but the spirit of the comment around children not being held accountable for the conduct of their parents, I agree with. The challenge and the technical challenge we've always faced is making sure we protect the security of every Australian in managing this situation. And so what the government has said and will continue to do is to work through the issue and to make sure that Australia's security isn't compromised in the process of confronting it. There's been no hard decisions that have been made. It's working through each individual case to do what we can do to protect Australia and protect Australian citizens.
Don't we have to take some risks for the sake of those children? I mean, I don't think be foolish about it, but we could have brought them back under secure conditions. They could have been...
And these are exactly the sorts of considerations that are being weighed up to make sure that we protect the interests of Australians who are here while also making sure we deal and confront with those challenges. Now, the individual case...
So what, there appeared to be a window of opportunity to do that. Why wasn't it done?
Well, respectfully, you'd have to ask that question to the Minister because obviously I'm not involved in that decision-making. But what the clear focus is to try and do what we can do for Australian citizens in the circumstances that present themselves. Of course, we didn't send that opportunity may have gone. Well, we didn't send those people there, as you know. And the situation that particularly the children are in is not the consequence of the Australian government. We have choices we have to make about how we manage this situation. It has to be done on the basis of protecting every Australian as well as considering the interests of those people.
Do you accept that it may in fact be much harder and more dangerous to do now than it was a week ago?
Yes, I do accept that.
Jennifer Hewett, what's your view on this?
Well, I think it's, as usual, one of the, whenever you talk about the Middle East, one of those incredibly complicated situations where there's no, I don't think it is quite as easy as Simon said. And
the ethical question is, maybe the practicality.
Well, the practical question is what governments tend to deal with, I think.
But why is it practically so difficult?
I think it was quite difficult to go in and rescue the children and then figure out what to do with their parents, their mothers usually, and I think the moment's been lost anyway. But it was not a simple, oh, we'll just go in and get them and then come out again and everything will be all right. And then you do have the idea of what would happen to the parents in Australia. I think they would go through the justice system. They would certainly be separated from their mother, if that's what you would actually think is important.
There are former jihadists back in Australia now. They've been put through the court system. Is it a problem necessarily to have them here and treat them in that way?
To treat the adult jihadists, treat them well. I think it's just another thing that which will end up in jail. Most of them, I would imagine. So, if you're saying that should the mothers have been brought out to face the justice system because of their children, along with their children, yes, I think they probably should have been. But again, it was not. It had to be dealt with, I think, in a way that was quite practically difficult and took time. I do think many of the countries whose citizens were there acting as jihadists do have responsibility to take them back and deal with them that way. But I just think this idea that it's, that was somehow the fault of the Australian government that they were there and that these children are put in this situation is also not reasonable.
Vicky Shu, how do you view this? Do you think Australia has some responsibility for these children particularly to bring them back here?
Absolutely. I don't think Australia should leave its citizens stateless. And as a matter of fact, there is a very high possibility that these camps will be captured by the Assad government, which not only regularly but also systematically tortures people. And this is not something we want to see that happen to Australian citizens, no matter what their belief systems are.
What would happen, Tim Wilson, if these people fell into the hands of the Syrian government and were kept in a prison there? What would our responsibility be then?
Well, our responsibility would be it is now, which is we have to confront the practical reality of a situation we haven't created. My hope, obviously, is that every Australian citizen is safe, but going back to the point, we have to do it in a way that works through the challenge here, because the big concern that the government has, and it's not just one that's randomly political or partisan, it's the challenge we have where people have gone off into conflict in areas where there are failed states, where there may not be the evidence to deal with issues around crimes and where they've been committed, and making sure they go through proper processes when they return home. Now, sometimes we can do that, but sometimes we don't have that information. That's why we have a a rich, complex area of laws that deal with the issues around foreign fighters and everything else. And what we don't want is people to come through because, of course, not unreasonably, should that situation arise and emerge, people will say, what did you do about it? Why did you allow this situation to create itself? So these are... Jen's right. The practicalities are extremely complicated, and we've got to make practical decisions about what's in the best interest of keeping every Australian safe.
Tim Watts, it's often easier, I suppose, to solve things from opposition, but do you see a solution here?
Well, Hamish, I think the important point that Giselle made was that this is something we've seen coming for quite some time. Aid groups on the ground there, like Save the Children, have been talking to parliamentarians and warning us that the window to safely extract these people would close. It seems like the present situation, the complexity of the status of these people is dramatically worse now.
And do you think that window has closed?
It's impossible for me to say from opposition, Hamish. I have even less information than Tim on this. I should say, though, I don't think anyone is trying to say that this is the government's fault that these people are in this situation. I think the argument here is that we do have an obligation to Australian citizens, children, who by no fault of their own find themselves in this situation. I mean, you know, we'd want an Australian government to look after our own children if they were in this situation.
But what can the government do now?
Well, it seems that the options are becoming fewer and fewer, Hamish, but that's why I say that the point Giselle made is that there may well have been a time in the past where there are more options available. Tim and I both voted for a number of pieces of legislation designed to facilitate the return of people from these areas, to put criminals on trial, put them in jail, which I don't know how that you could be any more safe, any more secure than jailing jihadists. Seems like a good response to me. There are also a range of provisions for, you know, control orders and surveillance and, you know, keeping an eye on people that we're not too sure about. So the infrastructure was there. It just hasn't happened before that window closed, it seems.
All right. Our next question tonight is from Mark Nalder.
So, Donald Trump just recently asked Scott Morrison to assist the White House in discrediting the Mueller probe, and by all reports, he's agreed to do so. What are the ethical problems with this, and are there any legal problems with this decision?
Simon Longstaff, ethical problems.
Well, I think there's already been some distinction made earlier on between the United States and its president. And I think the Prime Minister has been walking a very difficult tightrope between being a friend and ally of the United States and perhaps inadvertently being seen as a personal friend, a mate, if you like, of President Trump. And what the Prime Minister and the government was asked to do effectively by the United States was to investigate our own government, our former Foreign Minister. There's been various, I think, quite strong and misleading claims made about what Alexander was doing or not doing. And I think this is where the issue, which is frequently mentioned about our expectation that an Australian Prime Minister will act exclusively in Australian interests, has to be placed. We want him to get that on. So I don't want to take away the difficulty of how he has to do this, particularly for a personality like President Trump.
Yeah, I mean, shouldn't or couldn't Scott Morrison be, in fact, praised for making friends with someone like Donald Trump, who is incredibly mercurial and difficult to...
I think he could be praised for finding a way to relate to Mr Trump, whom I've never met, but he just looks from afar as a really challenging personality. Euphemism, if ever there was one. But also, I mean, he has to think too that there's I don't know what will happen in the next election in the United States, but he has to think about the possibility, whether it's through impeachment succeeding or through the electoral process, of not being seen to have been too partisan to that individual, as opposed to being, as I say, a good friend of the United States. And I think there are ethical issues about what he's agreed to do, how readily he's done it, in terms of looking into Downer, which seems to be what it was. But I think there are also political considerations as well.
Jennifer Hewett, do you see any ethical problems there? I mean, he was asked by the US President to assist with something. he very publicly said yes.
Yes, I don't see any ethical problems at all, basically because Alexander Downer did nothing wrong, and you can say, well, yes, we've looked at this and this is what happened, and that's most of us on the public record anyway. So I do not see any ethical considerations. What I do see is a lot of political considerations, and to Simon's point, you know, this is a very difficult relationship with the US at the moment, but I think Morrison has handled it pretty well, and I do not think that there's any danger really of him seeing somehow as some acolyte or mate of Trump's, but I think he's behaved and has kept stressing, which I think is politically important for him, that everything he does is in Australia's national interest. Now, you may disagree, and certainly I'm sure the Labor Party often does disagree with that, but I think he's talking to voters in Australia, and I think he's done a reasonable job of convincing them that he has not gone too far or would not compromise Australia's interests.
I want to put this back to Mark. You've heard two very different views on the ethical question here. Did either of them convince you?
If you're going to shake someone with muddy hands, that mud's going to stick to yours as well, so...
So that's just the price you pay for dealing with Donald Trump? Is that essentially what you're saying?
Yeah.
Do you accept that, Tim Wilson?
Well, I don't quite, because the basis of the relationship we have with the United States transcends, firstly, a president. The Prime Minister has to engage with the President. We don't elect who that person is, and so he has to shake hands and engage with that President regardless whether he likes him or not. And so long as proper process around investigations is being followed, it's not uncommon for Australia to cooperate with foreign governments when investigations are appropriate. But we need to make sure we have confidence in the robustness of their legal system and their system to make sure that it's being done appropriately. And that's the basis in which the government has sought to work through. And exactly as Jennifer Hewett just outlined, it's been pretty straightforward so far.
Mark, you've got your hand up again. What?
Would you agree to assist him? Would you agree to assist an inquiry?
Well, it would be completely inappropriate to me because I have no party or no involvement with it. And nor am I a part of a court system. So, but if I was working in a capacity around making sure that something is done as part of a fair process, as part of a justice system, I don't believe that it's responsible to turn around and say, I don't think the law should apply in this case or not, or I should be able to turn a blind eye to certain activities.
I think the point, though, that's got to be careful on is this a process, a legal process in search of justice, or has the inquiry been initiated for political purposes in order to discredit Mueller as part of a larger political agenda? I think, you know, as I say, I've got a lot of sympathy for the Prime Minister in this. It's a very delicate position he's in because he cannot afford, I don't think we can afford as a nation, to be seen as having become partisan in a political process. That's the difficult. Now, how he manages that, he's far better equipped to make that decision than I.
Heaven forbid that any inquiry should be done for political purposes.
Yeah, but heaven forbid if you become enmeshed in it. That's the problem.
I think that's a good point to turn to our last question tonight. It's from Ken Love.
Yeah, my question is about ethics and is directed to Simon Longfellow. It appears that politics, politicians, ethics and honesty are strange bedfellows when you consider the ABC's recent Australia Talk survey, which suggests that 90% of Australians do not trust politicians, that 70% of Australians think that political correctness has gone too far. Do you believe that this is correct, and is there a comment you'd like to make or a solution you could suggest?
Well, thanks very much, Ken. A couple of things about that. Has political correctness gone too far? Yes, as has what might be called conservative correctness. Any kind of correctness amongst those who peddle righteous indignation that tries to shut down conversations, I think is injurious to the kind of life that we want to live. So I'm opposed to them, whatever they're part of the political spectrum. But the core of your question, I think, about trust in institutions goes to something we were discussing earlier on about identity, which became a discussion about, you know, the mix of people and inclusion and things like that. I think it's a much bigger question. I mentioned it in an earlier answer about this concept of the ethical infrastructure of a society. We need technical infrastructure, we need physical infrastructure, and we also need to have healthy ethical infrastructure, the way that the professions operate, the role of political parties, the way in which parliaments operate, a proper recognition amongst politicians and we the citizens that our relationship can't be reduced to ones of transactions. We're not their customers in government. We are, as citizens, the source of all authority which is exercised by the political class. And I know lots of politicians, I mean, there's two of them here, who will have been motivated, I think, by high ideals that have gone in. But something happens inside that system at the moment, which, although it delivers a peaceful transfer of power, which is a remarkable thing in itself, has become divorced, I think, from what we expect. We expect something higher and better, I think, from those who go into political life. And whether it's politicians or the public service or a whole range of institutions, I think we need to look seriously at them, because when you lose trust to the degree to which the public has, and it's clear it's not about parties, it's right across the board, I think we damage our ability as a society both to realise the good that's before us, but particularly I think we are going to need to fix this infrastructure because of the challenges we face. AI, geopolitics and all the rest, they're massive challenges we face.
Ken, are you among the 90% of Australians that don't trust politicians?
Yes, I'd say I am.
Vicky, I'd like your perspective on this then. You've talked a lot about China and your distrust for leaders there. Are you surprised that 90% of Australians don't trust our politicians, or do you think they're right to have that mistrust?
I'm not super surprised, and I think it's probably somewhat healthy. It is somewhat healthy when you can distrust your politicians, you can doubt them, you can challenge them. It's not necessarily a bad thing. Whereas in authoritarian countries, you have controlled media, you have the journalists delivering talking points from politicians, and you have this trust that exists where people follow the party, where people follow the government's policies, where people repeat talking lines. One example would be Hong Kong is an economic issue. I'm sorry, but Hong Kong is not an economic issue. You know, this is what the Chinese government would try to make people believe. This is what's been repeated in the Chinese media, and unfortunately, you have a general public that actually believes that.
I want to give our politicians a chance to respond to this. I mean, let's do it in about the length of a tweet. What would you say to Ken about the reason to trust our politicians?
I'd say in the first instance that I feel it really acutely. It really does cause me a lot of despair to those statistics, and I feel them in my community as well, talking to people one-on-one. The thing I'd say is that this is a Catholic trend. It's happening around the world, not just in Australia, which suggests to me that it's something systemic.
And not just in politicians. Institutions in general.
So my theory is that there's something in the way that we interact with each other in the technological space that's broken that trust, and we haven't built the new institutions that we need yet to build trust.
Tim, what would your pitch be to trust politicians?
Well, firstly, I'd say whatever, and I take the comments that Simon made, but whatever my disagreements with Tim, I actually do believe he was motivated to get into politics by high ideals, and I believe even when I disagree with him, he's still pursuing that while dealing with the practical realities, and I would very much apply that to myself, because one of the core reasons I got involved with politics is a philosophy that motivated me to try and do the best for the nation. Everyone will have their own interpretations, but I've got to say, I also agree with Vicky. I mean, I'm a Liberal. I'm naturally sceptical of centralised power. And I don't actually think it's always bad that people distrust. One of the reasons why we have, if you go to a lot of authoritarian countries, you're exactly right, there's a very high degree because people have no alternative. Whereas one of the consequences of a high degree of transparency, and that is occurring across lots of institutions, is it means that people question, they challenge, they contrast, and they raise questions about the trust that they have in people and institutions for that reason.
And they see the difference, I think, also, and that's part of the transparency, between what people say and what they do.
That's also true.
Well,
it's also being held responsible.
That's right.
We hold them responsible on this program every week. That's all we have time for tonight. Would you please thank our panel, Simon Longstaff, Tim Wilson, Vicky Hsu, Jennifer Hewett